So you've got a new listing and the seller's like,
Hey, somebody died here. Do we have to disclose that?
and you're like,
I don't know.
well, I'm going to give you the three main components of disclosing psychologically impacted properties so you know exactly how to handle the disclosure and what's required. And listen, you got to stick around to the very end because I've got one bonus tip for you if you are ever working with a buyer who this might be important for that you have to know. So the first component is, what does this even apply to? When it comes to psychologically impacted properties, what kind of disclosures are we dealing with? Well, there's really a few categories that you have to be aware of. And the first one, what most people associate with when they think about this disclosure, is was there any homicide or suicide in the property? Now, it doesn't apply to any death at all. All it applies to are deaths related to a homicide or a suicide. Now, the other components you need to be aware of are it also applies to any other felonies that have taken place on the property. So you might have a buyer that's interested to know, is the seller aware of any other felonies that have taken place there? And the last piece is if somebody has been diagnosed with HIV, AIDS, or some other disease that is highly unlikely to be transmitted just by virtue of somebody living in the property, that's something else that the psychologically impacted property law talks about. So you got to be aware of all of those components when it comes to this law. The second component you need to know is how to handle the process for disclosure. So let's say you've got a buyer who is interested in whether there has ever been a homicide on the property. So here's what the law says. First of all, that buyer has to ask in writing. And the way they do that is through you, the listing broker, if you have the property listed. And then the law says that if they've asked you in writing, then you have to make inquiry of the seller and report back any findings that you get from the seller. And here's how that's going to work. You're going to go to the seller and say, hey, we've got this written request. Are you aware of any homicides in the property? And then what the law says is that the seller gets to determine how they're going to respond, which may not respond at all. And if they decide they don't want to respond, or maybe they do want to tell the buyer, then you will report back to the buyer any findings that you learn, which of course may be through the buyer's agent if they have one that's somebody other than you. The third piece of the law, is it mandatory? Do we have to do the disclosure? And the law says that these psychologically impacted factors are not material to the property. So there is no recourse. They cannot sue the seller or the listing broker for failure to disclose one of these psychologically impacted factors in the property. And in fact, the disclosure that we usually deal with, the Property Condition Disclosure Act, makes no mention of these psychologically impacted factors. And those are the only disclosures that are mandatory. So when it comes to the disclosure, it's really optional for the seller. They don't have to disclose it. And if they don't, then there is no recourse by the buyer. Hey, before we get to that bonus tip, will you do me a favor? Hit the like button down below and please subscribe so that we know you like these videos and we'll keep making them for you. But this brings us to the bonus tip that you need to know if you're ever working with a buyer who this is important for, because for some buyers, this is really important. And if you're working with that buyer, you need to make sure you know how to represent their interests in making this inquiry about psychologically impacted properties. And what you need to know is in the Oklahoma real estate form contract, this question of whether the property is psychologically impacted is something that has to be figured out during the inspection period. It's specifically listed in some of the factors that you might look at if you're going to do this inquiry during the inspection period, which means if the buyer finds out that there was some factor under this law that's important, then they can terminate the contract because of that, but they have to do it during the inspection period. They cannot terminate the contract after the inspection process is completely over if they find out later that there was some factor that might be important to them. So again, this is important for some buyers. And if you're in that situation, make sure you understand exactly how to handle that because you need to do it during the inspection period if that buyer might need to get out of the contract due to these psychologically impacted factors. So remember those three main components of the psychologically impacted properties in Oklahoma. The first one, what does it apply to? homicides, suicides, felonies, and HIV and AIDS and other similar diseases. Second of all, what's the process for disclosure? That buyer's got to ask in writing. The listing agent has to make an inquiry of the seller and report back what the seller's findings are. And third, is this mandatory? Well, the law says it's not. It is not a material fact that must be disclosed, but it is mandatory that if you're asked as the listing broker, you do need to make the inquiry, but the disclosure itself after that is not mandatory on the seller. And don't forget that last little bonus tip. If you're working with the buyer who this is important for, you need to make sure that you make this inquiry during the inspection period so that if the buyer does want to cancel the contract because of psychologically impacted factors, they do that during the inspection period. Hey, if you like this video, I would love it if you would head on over to our website, rpro.academy, and sign up for our email list so you can stay up to date on all of the content and valuable education that we have coming your way.